Irish migrants in the 1950s, Britain ate far more varied, improvised meals than people assume, shaped by budget, distance from home, and whatever towns offered. 1. Bread and dripping. Bread and dripping turned up in almost every lodging because it solved a simple problem. People needed something cheap that filled the gap between shifts. A housing clerk in Paddington kept notes on the shared kitchens he inspected, and one entry mentions a pan of cooled fat left beside a half-cut loaf on a chipped plate, which fits what tenants said later about how little equipment they actually used. Dripping varied from place to place. Some came from the Sunday roast a landlord cooked for themselves. Some was bought in small tubs from butchers who rendered leftovers during quiet hours. Either way, it spread easily on thick bread, and the salt already mixed into the fat meant no extra seasoning was required. For workers heading to building sites or factories before dawn, that mattered more than variety or presentation. Most rooms had only a single ring stove or nothing at all, so toasting the bread wasn't guaranteed. People ate it plain, often standing up, grabbing a slice before racing for a tram or bus. The same clerk mentioned that the plate was rarely washed between uses. 2. Boiled potatoes and salt. Why were Irish workers in the 1950s, London and Liverpool, still eating plain boiled potatoes with nothing more than salt? In hostel kitchens attached to building sites and hospitals, rota sheets from welfare officers list spuds, salt beside tea as the evening provision, squeezed between shifts and curfews. Potatoes could be bought loose, by the stone, from barrows off Edge Lane or street markets in Kilburn, still cheap even when wages were low and rent took most of the pay packet. An enamel pot, a gas ring that worked more often than it didn't, and a chipped knife were enough to turn them into a meal, which made them far more practical than meat or anything that needed an oven or careful storage. In mixed lodging houses, English and Scottish tenants might pick up sliced bread or tinned soup on the way home. Irish labourers kept returning to the sack of potatoes in the corner because nothing else fed as many people as reliably from that little equipment. Ministry of Labour reports on migrant hostels treat the menu as an efficiency problem, listing calories and cost per head, but Irish tenants were quietly treating those potatoes as a link back to the pattern of eating they already knew. Boiled with their skins on and sprinkled with salt at the table, they sat in the same place in the day as the main thing of dinner had at home, even if the room now looked out over bomb damage or railway arches instead of fields. The contrast is strange on paper. Men working on huge post-war construction jobs, walking past Lions, cafeterias and fish and chip shops, then going upstairs to eat something their grandparents would have recognized instantly. In plenty of those rooms, the only hot food most evenings was a bowl of salted potatoes. 3. Bacon rashers and fried bread. People picture bacon rashers and fried bread as an everyday thing. But for most Irish labourers in the 1950s, London and Liverpool, it sat firmly in the if there's money left category. The fry-up waited for weekends, usually the first morning after payday, when lads who'd had a full week on the sites or on the buses could spare a few extra shillings. Someone bought a few rashers from the nearest pork butcher, another picked up yesterday's sliced loaf going cheap, and they'd crowd round a single pan in a shared kitchen while strips of meat hit the heat, and old bread went in afterwards to soak up everything left behind. The meat was stretched carefully, diced and shared, with the fried bread doing most of the actual filling. In some Paddington and Kilburn boarding houses, a landlady who had enough regulars on good wages would throw in bacon and fried bread on Sunday mornings, but only if the rent box had actually filled during the week. One cook from a Liverpool digs remembered keeping a separate tin under the counter for bacon money, topped up from overtime. For the men eating it, the plate was as much proof of steady work as it was breakfast, a small sign that they'd had enough hours on the scaffold or the buses to justify spending on meat instead of just tea, bread and potatoes. They talked through county gossip and football results over those weekend fry-ups, wiped the last streaks of fat from the plate with the same bread that had been bulk food all week, and then went back on weekdays to the cheaper, plainer meals until the next payslip made rashers and fried bread possible again. 4. Tea with evaporated milk. Tea with evaporated milk wasn't a quirky preference. It was what actually worked in those rooms. Kettle on the hob, chipped mug on the table, a spoon of strong loose tea or the cheapest bag that could be found, and then the thick canned milk going in, turning it a dense caramel color that ordinary bottle milk never managed. A co-op price list from the mid-1950s shows big tins were only slightly dearer than fresh, but they sat quite happily on a shelf for weeks in a house where the fridge was an open window or a stone step outside the back door. In London, hostels and Liverpool terraces, Irish lodgers were often told by landladies that the shared refrigerator, if there was one, was for her family's food, not for boarders' bottles that went off or cluttered the shelf. So tins stacked under beds or in suitcases made more sense than glass left to sour. That same canned milk went into porridge on early shifts, into makeshift custard on Sundays, and sometimes straight over bread when wages were thin. But it was the mug of dark, sweetened tea, with a cloudy tide mark of evaporated milk on the inside of the cup, that turned up several times a day. 5. Sausage sandwiches. By 1959, sausage sandwiches were standard fuel. On many sites, breakfast meant 2 links in bread. They existed because butchers needed somewhere for scraps. Trimmings, fat and rind went through the mincer together. A butcher's assistant off Scotland Road described loading long chains of pale sausages into metal trays for the cafes and boarding houses. He said they went out in crates before dawn, with delivery boys pushing barrows between shops and corner cafes. Irish labourers met that system from the other end. In Kilburn, Camden, Bootle or Kirkdale, men handed over a few coins, and kitchens fried through stacks of sausages in one heavy pan. The bread usually mattered more to the budget than the meat. Cafes bought economy loaves by the dozen, shaved the slices thinner, and turned one wholesale tin of sausages into dozens of paid-for sandwiches. Rationing on meat ended in 1954, yet many high street sausages in working districts still leaned heavily on rusk, water and flavourings. So men finishing a night shift and paying for a sausage sandwich often got something far closer to seasoned cereal with a trace of meat wrapped in bread. 6. Porridge or an oatmeal. By the time the men reached the bus stop, the porridge was already sitting heavy. Bowls were rinsed, pots were left to soak. The warmth wore off fast in the cold air, but it had done the main job. Something solid in their stomachs before hours of carrying bricks, digging roads, or scrubbing hospital floors on early shifts. In crowded digs where several lodgers shared one narrow stove, oats were practical because one saucepan could feed 4 or 5 workers, stretched with more water on tight weeks, and finished with a quick shake of salt rather than butter or sugar, which cost more and disappeared faster if left on a shared shelf. What stands out in a lot of memories is how little ceremony there was around it. People ate standing up in coats, leaning on the back of a chair, burning their mouths because the clock mattered more than the taste. Some stirred it until it was almost smooth. Others left it coarse so it felt like there was more to chew, and those tiny differences told you who had grown up with this as a normal breakfast, and who still saw it as a step down from the food they'd left behind. The pattern repeats in boarding houses, hostels and rented rooms all over London and Liverpool in the 1950s. One cheap pan, a bag of oats, a pinch of salt, and then a full day's work built on something as plain as that. And it's hard to know how many of them would have chosen anything else if they'd really had the choice. 7. Tinned peas and carrots. How often did those tins actually matter? In Kilburn and Liverpool lodgings, tins lived on a high shelf. When veg ran short, the landlady opened a tin and poured out the mix. Some former lodgers remembered it as a weekly habit. Others swore the cans only appeared at the end of the month, when pay packets were thin and the corner shop had little left. That uneven memory fits the period, because habits from wartime rationing lingered well into the 1950s, and plenty of households still treated any canned vegetables as backup stock rather than something you served every night. For the Irish workers renting cramped rooms, that spoonful of soft peas and carrots beside the potatoes might be the only vegetables eaten all day. 8. Liver and onions. The onions went in first, hacked into thick rings that never quite matched in size. They softened around the edges of the pan. Only when they'd started to colour did the liver appear. Thin sheets from the market. dusted with flour at the last moment so they wouldn't weld to the metal and fall apart before they ever reached the plate. Most of that liver came from stalls that specialized in offcuts. It was stacked in trays at the back, away from the neater chops. Earlier buyers with more money had taken the joints and steaks, leaving this pile of organ meat that stall holders were happy to clear for a few pennies to laborers who timed their visit late in the morning, knowing prices dropped once the best cuts were gone. Preparation took more effort than the price suggested. Bits of membrane had to be picked away. Only then was each piece dipped and dredged, the flour clinging so that, when it met the pan, it formed a thin crust that kept the meat from turning tough against the fierce heat of a gas ring shared by everyone on the landing. The onions did more than bulk out the plate. They stained the fat and thickened the scrapings in the pan. By the time the gas was turned off, only a ring of onion was left stuck hard to the rim, browned almost to black against the metal. 9. Stew. Made from scraps ladle already in motion, the stew pot sat on a back ring while men came and went from shared corridors off Kilburn High Road or Scotland Road. By the mid-1950s, that pot was more routine than any posted mealtime rota. Rent in those houses covered a bed, and if you were lucky, access to one battered stove. Everything else came from the day's scrounging. A few brought ends of stewing beef from a sympathetic butcher, others tipped in cheap carrots or a couple of soft potatoes bought near closing when market traders wanted rid of stock. Scraps that wouldn't stretch to a meal on their own suddenly mattered. A navvy, finishing a shift on a site in Paddington, might save the trimmed fat from his canteen serving, while a dock worker in Liverpool brought home a small wrapped piece of lamb breast that hadn't sold, so by 8 or 9 at night there was enough to justify filling the pot properly. Water went in first, then whatever flavour boosters people could manage, a stock cube, a spoon of dripping kept in a tin, sometimes a handful of barley brought from home in an old tobacco tin, all left to simmer until meat separated from bone and the vegetables had given up most of their shape into a thick, uneven mixture that looked different every day because the ingredients never matched twice. People treated their share with a kind of rough hierarchy. The men who'd supplied the largest chunk of meat were served first. Those short on wages lined up behind and watched the level drop, and anyone arriving very late after a shift or a pint got more of the liquid and fewer solid pieces than they were hoping for, which sat awkwardly beside official leaflets talking about balanced meals and carefully planned nutrition. Once everyone had eaten, the pot rarely went straight to the sink. It was shuffled to a cooler ring or a side of the stove, topped with a bit more water, and brought back to life the next morning, so that the same stew, now thinner and darker, could be ladled out again before another day's work. 10. Cod and chips. Cod and chips in the early 1950s still carried traces of wartime habits. Shops wrapped portions in whatever newsprint they could get, usually yesterday's paper, folded fast into a cone that held together long enough for the walk home. That shape mattered more than people realize. It let a laborer eat with one hand on a crowded tram or while waiting outside a factory gate for the night shift to turn over. The cod itself varied wildly. Supply lines were steady again after rationing ended in 1954, but trawlers landing in Hull, Grimsby, Fleetwood or Milford Haven brought in catches of different sizes, so a filly in Bootle might look nothing like one sold in Kilburn. Prices shifted too, still influenced by state controls that were easing but not fully gone. Most fryers used beef dripping because it was reliable and familiar, though some coastal shops mixed in vegetable oils when deliveries were uncertain. Whether it counted as a weekly luxury or just a way to stay fed depended on how far the next payday felt. 11. Tinned corned beef. Why did so many shared houses keep a tin of corned beef on the shelf? It was cheap. It kept. One key ran around the side of the can and, with a bit of effort, released a block that fed 2 or 3 men in a lodging where the cooker was unreliable and morning shifts started before the shops opened. In the mid-1950s, the same square tins showed up in Irish-run grocers from Camden Town to Garston, placed close to day-old bread and packets of tea because regulars bought those 3 things together. They treated it like emergency pay, a standby meal for weeks when money was late, or a foreman's promised overtime didn't appear. Welfare officers raised concerns about the salt content even then, though reports from the period make clear that people with long hours and limited kitchens prioritized convenience over those worries, especially in hostels where anything kept in the shared fridge tended to vanish. So the unopened tin stayed on top of the wardrobe, waiting for the day someone needed guaranteed protein with no fuss. 12. Bread pudding. Yesterday's loaves are stacked by the back door. They're not waste yet, just demoted stock. A junior baker tears them into chunks, soaks them in sweetened tea, then slides the bowl along. In 1950s working-class streets, especially in northern towns, this was routine practice long before opening time the next day. Shop signs pushed fresh bloomers and crusty rolls. The tray of bread pudding usually appeared only after tea time, once the day's proper bread had mostly gone. It solved a problem accountants cared about. Stale bread that couldn't be sold at full price became square portions that could be wrapped in greaseproof paper and handed over for a few pennies, still counted on the taking sheet as income rather than loss. Council catering officers talked about thrift and nutrition, but their internal budgets rewarded kitchens that kept bread orders steady while trimming wastage columns. By closing, most of that backdoor stack had left the premises as pudding, eaten in houses that never saw the ledger that decided it should exist. 13. Jelly and custard. Why did boarding house Sundays so often end with jelly and custard? In a lot of 1950s digs, the meal was paid for as dinner with pudding, so something sweet had to appear, whether the joint was generous or thin. Jelly crystals and custard powder were cheap, kept well in a tin by the stove, and didn't depend on the oven working properly, which mattered in houses where the range was old and temperamental. A landlady could make up a big glass bowl on Saturday night, set it on a cool pantry shelf, then heat milk for custard in one saucepan after the plates were cleared. Pamphlets talked about balanced meals and fruit desserts, but in many working-class streets, the bright wobbling jelly quietly stood in for fruit, and the custard covered the fact there wasn't much meat to begin with, turning a modest roast into something that still felt like a full Sunday spread. In some houses, the only thing that changed from week to week was the color of the jelly. 14. Potatoes, mashed with margarine. Most weekday mash in 1950s, working-class Britain was made with margarine. Butter waited in the background unless visitors were coming. On the plate, the potatoes looked plain, a washed-out off-white, beaten with a fork and thinned with a splash of milk to cover more of the dish. By the mid-50s, butter and margarine had only just come off ration, but shop ledgers and price lists show marge still cheaper by several pence a pound, which mattered when a lodging house cook was feeding 6 on one wage and looked sensible to anyone doing the accounts. The fat came in wrapped blocks, stacked easily in cool pantries, less likely to vanish than butter pats in a crowded house, and it melted quickly into hot potatoes. Advert posters promised vitamin spreads and happy families, while in many bedsits, the same brick of margarine went from toast at breakfast to mash at night. Every so often, though, someone stirred in a knob of real butter saved from a neighbor, and the mash on those evenings broke the house rule about using margarine first. 15. Mince and gravy over bread, pan on, fat melting, mince going in. Bread is already laid on the plates, sliced from yesterday's loaf. Flour gets shaken over the pan, water added, and the whole thing stirred until it turns into a gravy that can cover more bread than meat. In a terrace house near the docks, this is weekday tea. Half a pound from the butcher is crumbled down, chased round the pan until the liquor turns brown. The bread underneath does most of the filling up, soaking what would have slipped off a spoon. Potatoes might be there, but they're optional when bread is cheaper and already on hand. Cookery books talk about mince with mashed potato, neatly served on plates. Landladies and mothers chasing rent and coal money care more about how many slices one pan will cover. Children get the thicker spoonfuls poured towards their end of the plate. Adults make do with the edges where the gravy thins out. On payday, the same mince is suddenly hidden under proper mashed potato, and nobody mentions the bread. 16. Cabbage boiled with bacon pieces. Most of the bacon in those pans had crossed the Irish Sea first. Cheap, streaky sides were salted and cured in Limerick or Cork, cut down into rough offcuts, then packed into wooden boxes headed for Liverpool and Holyhead. By the early 1950s, when meat rationing was still biting, British wholesalers rebadged those trimmings as cooking bacon and sent them on again to Irish streets in London, Birmingham, Glasgow. Cabbages were local, pulled from small greengrocers and barrows, but the salty meat usually arrived by rail van and then small lorry before it ever saw a Belfast sink. The dish looked simple: chopped cabbage, a few hunks of bacon, everything boiled in one pot until the water clouded. Behind it sat a quiet logistics chain, linking Irish curing houses, port warehouses, municipal markets, and finally, back kitchens above pubs or behind corner shops. Official nutrition leaflets talked about vitamins and balanced meals. What actually landed on plates depended more on which bacon pieces the traveling salesman was pushing that week. 17. Rice pudding. People tend to imagine rice pudding as a home thing, but the real workhorse version lived in big metal trays behind canteen counters. In the early post-war years, catering guides for schools and factories set it out in strict ratios: broken rice, skimmed milk, or reconstituted dried milk, sugar, a bit of margarine, with nutmeg only if the budget stretched. By the mid-50s, commercial caterers were buying rice in sacks by weight and loading it into steam-jacketed pans, where one person could stir enough pudding for a few hundred portions before it was tipped into enameled dishes and left to firm along the hot plate. Old canteen manuals don't always agree on whether eggs were standard or a luxury, and there's a similar blur over how sweet it was meant to be, which matches memories of some bowls being almost plain while others felt close to a dessert treat. Cafes on high streets used the same basic method, but baked smaller batches in shallow tins, cutting squares to serve with a spoonful of jam on top, and it's hard to tell how many people knew that the recipe on the wall and the one in the pot were often quietly different. 18. Meat pies. What made a corner shop meat pie worth spending wages on? In 1950s, Britain, that answer depended on the pie you picked. Pork pies were cold, solid, and safe in a paper bag, bought on a Saturday morning with the rest of the shopping. Steak pies lived in the hot cabinet by the till, glass fogged, pastry going soft by late afternoon. Then there were hand warmers, small, cheap hot pies wrapped in thin paper, sold to bus conductors, dockers, and lads heading to the match, eaten one-handed while the other stayed buried in a coat pocket. Official leaflets talked about proper meals with vegetables and pudding, but the reality was a shopgirl finishing a late shift and calling a meat pie and a cup of tea her tea. Some owners quietly shrank the pies or bulked out the filling, claiming costs were rising faster than the labels ever admitted. Others sliced them in half for schoolchildren and charged a few coppers, so one pie ended up feeding two people who never saw a plate. 19. Tinned salmon. Occasionally. The tin lived at the back of the cupboard, kept upright, label facing forward. It was the thing nobody touched on an ordinary Tuesday. Families called it the salmon, as if there were only ever one, even though it was usually the cheapest pink stuff, bought when it was on offer and then ignored for weeks. It came out for birthdays, Easter teas, the odd Sunday when visitors were coming, and sausages felt a bit too plain for putting on the table. Once opened, it did a lot of work for its price: spread over buttered bread, folded through sliced lettuce, mixed with a bit of vinegar and mashed potato to make fish cakes that looked more generous than the tin really allowed. In some terraces, it was Christmas Eve tea, sitting next to tinned fruit and sliced bread, deliberately held back all year so guests saw salmon on the plate, while the rest of the time that same family lived on scraps of cheaper fish. 20. Sandwiches from work canteens. The bread was almost always white and sliced. Standard catering loaves, square and thin, were easier to stack, spread, and cut on a tight schedule. In most big workplaces, canteen staff worked in quiet production lines. One person laid out trays of bread, another spread margarine, another added fillings from bulk tubs, then someone wrapped or lidded them before the dinner rush hit. Egg sandwiches started with trays of eggs boiled in steam-jacketed pans. They were cooled, run through industrial slicers or mashers, then mixed with catering mayonnaise and a bit of seasoning, giving a filling that could sit in the fridge for hours without separating. Cheese sandwiches were quicker. Blocks of mild cheddar went through rotary graters, then into plastic tubs, sometimes stretched with grated carrot or onion to make it go further. Ham was sliced from uniform catering joints, more pressed than carved. It arrived vacuum-packed, already shaped to fit the bread, which made service fast, but meant every ham sandwich in the building looked almost exactly the same. 21st Sunday roast, when invited. Serving starts before the chairs even settle. Someone cuts the meat, someone else slides vegetables onto plates, and the table fills in a steady, practiced order. A single case from parish charity notes in the early 1950s gives a clear glimpse. A household near Kilburn hosted newcomers on certain Sundays, offering a roast when funds allowed. The meal depended on whatever joint had been purchased that week, often stretched with potatoes and greens gathered from different kitchens in the same building. Visitors learned the routine by watching it unfold. The host carved first, the plates moved clockwise, and any latecomer slotted in silently, taking whatever portion remained. The part that lingers is how the meal repeated itself even when circumstances shifted. Families moved, wages changed, but the same serving pattern returned whenever the roast appeared. It tied the group together, more through habit than ceremony, looping back to that first shared table where everyone copied the motions without being told. The notes never explain why certain guests were included and others weren't. 22. Club biscuits and tea cakes. Club bars were already turning up in Irish workers' lunch tins by the mid-1950s because Jacobs had a stable distribution route from its Aintree works to small shopkeepers along Liverpool's terraced streets. Their layered structure was surprisingly robust: a pressed biscuit slab, a thin cocoa cream, and a chocolate shell set on cooling racks that moved through the plant in slow increments. Tea cakes came from different operations entirely, often from regional confectioners that piped marshmallow onto stamped biscuit rounds before sending them under a curtain of melted coating, a method that left a ridge around the base where the chocolate pooled. Sugar allocations were improving after rationing ended in 1953, but the supply never felt guaranteed, so quantities shifted week to week even while shelves kept a token stock. Workers chose these items partly because they packed tightly into enamel lunchboxes without breaking, and partly because their wrappers stayed intact in damp pockets. A red and green club wrapper often sat beside the flask cup at break time. 23. Soda bread, homemade or from Irish shops. People often assume soda bread was hard to find in 1950s Britain, yet most Irish newcomers arrived with a wrapped loaf in their luggage. It travelled well. Back home it cost little to make. Soft flour, bicarbonate of soda, salt, and whatever milk had started to sour. Many households baked it the night before the sailing, then sent it with sons and daughters heading for digs in London, Liverpool, or Coventry. Once there, the loaf meant more than breakfast. It marked out who had family links strong enough to supply them, and who had to make do with factory bread from the nearest corner shop. Irish-run bakeries appeared slowly, often tucked beside labour exchanges or tram stops, turning out rounds scored into quarters so they could be shared easily in crowded houses. That habit echoed how it was divided at home during lean stretches, even though the circumstances were different. If the loaf changed hands early in the week, did that count as generosity or quiet pressure to keep connections alive? 24. Fry-ups in transport cafes. A fry-up in a 1955 transport cafe might use just one egg per plate. That sounds stingy for a full breakfast, but it let the cafe stack everything else round it. 2 thin sausages, a strip or 2 of bacon, a slice of fried bread, and maybe half a grilled tomato, all cooked in the same pan so nothing needed extra fuel or washing up. Those plates weren't about variety. They were about packing as many calories as possible into something a driver could finish in 15 minutes before getting back on the A5 or the Great North Road. Fat from the bacon and sausages soaked into the bread, the yolk spread across the plate, and beans, when they were included at all, were there as a cheap filler. Tea came in thick mugs, paid for separately, but refills worked on whatever informal system the owner felt like running that week. Menus from these places rarely survive, so exact lineups shift from memory to memory, yet one thing comes up again and again: a chipped white plate, heavy with food, balanced on a formica table dotted with brown sauce. 25. Stew pot curries and post-war exotic dishes. What did curry actually mean in a 1950s British terrace kitchen? Usually it started with leftovers. A pot of yesterday's stewed beef or lamb was stretched with water, a spoon or two of generic yellow curry powder from the local co-op, and maybe a chopped apple or a handful of sultanas to sweeten the sharp edges of the spice. Those mild stew pot curries showed up at church socials, factory canteens, and school fundraising teas. Rice wasn't guaranteed. Plenty of people served them over mashed potato or with sliced white bread because that's what was already in the house, and bags of long grain were still uncommon on some high streets. So curry and mash became as normal as curry and rice in a lot of working-class homes, even as Coronation Chicken in 1953 put a polite, buffet-friendly version of the same idea in front of more middle-class diners with its mix of cold chicken, mayonnaise, and curry powder. For migrants who arrived with their own ideas of spice and heat, how far did that pale, stew-based curry feel from the word they recognized?